So I had a pretty significant response to one of the posts I put out on TikTok and Instagram. And it was basically about the fact that, we've been asking a lot of ourselves, right? We thought it was reasonable that we could have, dinner on the table every night, great marriages that we're working on all the time, raise our kids and do it in such a way that we're the parent to be admired. Oh, of course, have a full career as well. And not just a full career, but be the best at that full career. Women really are expecting quite a bit of themselves. And so when you hit midlife and you start to see some cracks here and you realize this is some fresh bullshit. There's no way that it was ever reasonable for us to keep up with that. But for sure, moving forward, we're not going to have the capacity for it. You've heard me talk about it millions of times on the podcast, but estrogen goes down and with it goes away our stress resiliency for a whole variety of reasons. And I posted this, but I also made the statement that it's not us that's broken, right? It's the system is what's broken, but we keep pulling it back to we must be broken, right? And I also was really interested when I started to post and talk about this, that people resonated so much with the idea that it's really related to early trauma in your family or in your development growing up, childhood stuff, right? That's basically coming back and needs to be addressed. And I kept getting questions why? That doesn't make any sense at all. Why is something that I put away all of these 50 years since childhood coming up now? And what the heck? Why do I need to address that now? Well, turns out I'm a trauma therapist. And so I want to talk about this subject since it had so much interest. And certainly I want to hear from you. So please keep listening today. And also make sure that you're posting in all the places on social media that you find this, because I want to know a little bit more. I'm very interested in hearing a little bit more about what you want to hear. Welcome. You're listening to The Centered Midlife, a podcast that teaches women in midlife to unapologetically stop silencing their dreams and start designing the lives they want to live in. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie, and as a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a twice-divorced single mother myself, I not only know how hard it can feel heading into midlife, I am living it right here with you. I've taken all the many failed attempts and lessons learned in my own life and combine it with my extensive clinical experience to give you the tools you need to make midlife the best time in your life. No joke. So let's get started. Welcome back, everybody. All right. So we are trying to make this centered midlife for ourselves from the inside out, right? We're doing the inside work. And one of the biggest pieces of inside work is in psychology. We call it a lot of things, but it could be inner child work, could be shadow work. I suppose if you're really more cognitive behavioral, it's reframing or shifting. Core belief systems might be a way of coming at it, but it's all coming at about the same thing. I look at it as inner child work. And when I made this post originally, and I'll link it in wherever you're finding this podcast, so you can go if you didn't see, but I put this out on TikTok and Instagram and I just got thousands of responses because people were like, oh yeah, this is totally about childhood, coming up again for me. And I was really intrigued that resonated so much for people, but it is such a true story for women in midlife. And here's why. So estrogen and progesterone, they have kind of their rise and fall during the main part of our childbearing years, right? So estrogen is kind of ramping up from the beginning to the middle of the month. And then from the middle of the month to the end, progesterone starts to rise. So we don't have both high or both low at the same time. They kind of are doing this all the time. And with estrogen comes a whole lot of extra stress resilience neurochemicals, right? And so there are things that you've heard and you might know a little bit about, things like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, all of these, like GABA, all of these chemicals that make us feel less anxious and more calm and more grounded, or keep us in the chase and keep us motivated and keep us going from day to day, or make us feel good and make us feel like we have purpose and importance in the world, right? Well, as estrogen goes down when we head into midlife, so does our ability to generate those neurochemicals with the efficiency that we had before. Now, our body is going to figure it out, right? Like the body is an amazing place and it is adjusting during perimenopause. And by the time we get to menopause, man, all of that stuff has really evened out. And menopause, if you don't know, the diagnosis of that is that you've gone for a full year without menstruation. And so by that time, we're pretty certain that, you're on the other side of childbearing to non-childbearing years, and your body has figured out how to do all the things that it needs to do. Now, it's a different body altogether. So there still is limitations to the stress resilience, but you will start to learn how to efficiently and effectively use serotonin and make serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine and GABA and all of those things. So in the meantime, though, what is happening is we have no tolerance. Like legitimately. And we all know this, right? Like there's so many memes about like, I have no more. I have not one nerve left. You can't get on my nerves because I've got zero left to give. So I completely understand this. Like last year was one of the most difficult years for me. And for me, because I couldn't go on hormone replacement to get that in a better place, which is an option that I definitely strongly want you to consider with your medical providers, but it's not the only option. Psychoactive drugs, so things like anti-anxiety medications, and it's just a whole host of psychotropics that could be useful at this time. And it might mean that no other time in your life do you need to use that, right? It doesn't mean you have to be on these medications forever, but it does take that edge off during the time that your body is learning how it's going to do this on its own differently than it did in childbearing years, where that estrogen and progesterone rhythm was real even, and the levels in and of themselves were higher, and then they triggered the levels of other things higher. I want you to understand that having the estrogen and progesterone that we do makes us better humans. Full stop, right? Makes us better humans. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that the organism that then creates the new life, births the new life, and will have to nurture that life to a certain age before it can go out on its own and do its own thing, would want to have a lot of tolerance, a high level of tolerance, if you will, a superhuman level of tolerance. That is what women are gifted with, right? That's what we're gifted with. Now, here's where the systemic issue is, though. Here's where it rubs, where these two things come together. We have this superhuman capacity to tolerate distress, put up with shit, deal with it anyway, and keep on moving, right? All through the childbearing years where our estrogen and progesterone are regulated. At the same time, the system, our culture, our families, society, all of the isms that are there, all of that creates an environment that expects too much of us. But here's the thing, we can take it because we're superhuman in our ability to tolerate that. And that's the rub, my friends. So we have built an entire life around doing more than is reasonable and thinking and believing it was reasonable because our superhuman neurochemicals led us to believe that. What we get left with during perimenopause and menopause is normal humanity, right? And perimenopause is a mess because it's lower than it will even out at in menopause sometimes. And it's higher sometimes. It's lower, it's higher, and it's lower. It's so erratic, so chaotic, no stabilization, which is why we suggest you talk to your medical providers about things like HRT or other psychotropic medications to help you regulate emotionally, cognitively during that period of time, right? Instead of holding yourself responsible for making all of that go down, like you are somehow having a moral failing. You're not keeping up with all this. Like, no, it was never that, right? It's that the expectation, the system setup was already unfair. The system is set up against us. It is not set up for us. But the problem is that it met this superhuman ability to tolerate distress and keep moving. Evolutionarily, makes sense. Women should be able to do that when they bear children and raise them. However, it doesn't help us then when our cultural belief about it and our belief about ourselves and our world is that I am morally failing now in my 40s and 50s because I can't keep up with what I used to. Like, I used to be able to do this. Man, I used to get dinner on the table. I used to remember all the assignments. I used to remember all of our schedule. It was in my head without even looking at a calendar. Maybe I had a calendar, but like I was able to keep all those balls in the air all the time. I could work. I had a good marriage. I could do this. I could do that. But now I can't. And that must mean there's something wrong with me. There is nothing wrong with you. In fact, that is exactly how you should be feeling right now. And it's super frustrating to be there because culture also would like to blame shift it over to us. You know, culture also kind of downplays like, well, you should be able, this is just midlife. You should be able to handle that. Like, oh, it's an adjustment. It's a transition. Still believing that we're going to have that superhuman level of stress resilience that we just can't. We cannot fabricate it. We cannot make it happen, right? Maybe there's a level of HRT where we have as much hormone in our body as we did when we were menstruating and childbearing, but I wouldn't advise that because nobody needs to be drugged out like that. And that's literally what it was. It's like we were tripping for decades. We were superhuman tripping on all of these neurochemicals that kept us going. But unfortunately, it met this systemic problem of always expecting way more than is reasonable of ourselves. So now we hit this point and it just feels like the bottom has fallen out, but we're also pointing the fingers at ourselves and we're believing the BS that people tell us that it must be our fault. Like, why can't you keep up with all of this? So I want to normalize, hey, first of all, A, you should be there. And B, this never was your fault. This was never your problem. But if we come back to the premise of this podcast, which is to have that centered, grounded midlife, like really love your life, love the life that you have right now, the one that you're in right now, and truly enjoy it, flaws and all. I am not saying get to the point where you can love your life. I'm saying whatever's going on in your life right now, the good and the not good, that you love it, that you're enjoying yourself. That is what a centered life is. And that is what I'm trying to help you to strive for. Well, it's gonna have to have some piece of coming to grips with the fact that you've always expected too much of yourself. And hey, that's not your fault. That was how the system was set up. But you're gonna have a reckoning on this plate that you put all of these things on. You have all these things on your plate. Yeah, it's breaking. So either you're going to decide what comes off that plate intentionally, or the plate's going to break and it's going to decide for you. But there is literally no other option. Plate breaks or you take things off the plate, but there is no other option. And that's the difference between a centered midlife and a midlife crisis. Plate breaks, you're having a midlife crisis. You intentionally take things off your plate, you have a centered midlife. Now, what does this have to do with childhood trauma? Well, this is really interesting. I work with individuals that have, for the most part, they had interpersonal trauma. So it was like, abusive parents or some sort of major relationship rift or problem, or feeling like you always had to hustle for your worth, like you never were good enough in an environment growing up, or high levels of neglect. So parents weren't bad. They weren't not bad. They just weren't there. Or caregivers were just not there. Sound familiar? Because Gen X has a lot of this, you guys. Like, parenting was neglectful during that whole generation. So even if your parents are great people, it is possible that you missed pieces of your neurodevelopment and your emotional development and even your cognitive development because you didn't have the caretaking level that you should have, and attachment to a caregiver at the level that you should have. Why would that resurge now? Well, it makes sense, right? Like, during our superhuman phase, one of the things that we expected of ourselves was, well, I'm not dealing with that. Like, I'm putting that under the rug. That ain't coming out. I'm done. I have this awful mom and she's been awful to me all my life. She's kind of narcissistic. Yeah, I just put up with her. Like, I just blow her off, or I do the holidays anyway and I just go past it, right? For human distress tolerance, think about this. You've been putting up with an unreasonable amount of what that childhood trauma has created for you. But if you have unresolved issues, if you haven't figured out what those patterns are, if you haven't cleaned that stuff up, you're going to get hit hard in midlife, right? So I'll give you an example. I'll go back to the narcissistic mom, because you see a lot of stuff like this online, but like you have a parent that had to make it all about them all the time, right? It was, you're going through a divorce, you're going through a huge life change. And every time you call this parent, they're like, oh, I just don't know how I'm going to handle you going through this. This has just really like been the most awful thing for me that you're going through this, right? Like it's that kind of, this doesn't make any sense. This is not about you, mom. This is about my life and what's happening to me. But mom doesn't seem to grasp that, right? And I bet you've had a certain amount of resiliency with this parent for a long time. It's gone. You just don't. So now the fact that that pattern has persisted, not even persisted, but it's been consistently reinforced across decades, it comes to roost. And this is why sometimes in midlife, you start to see women or men make decisions to have stark changes in the kind of people that they have around them. This is why you see a higher rate of divorce for women in midlife. This is why you see people cutting off their families and not doing holidays with the families anyway. This is why you start to see that happen, because that pattern has been so unhelpful, did not serve you, probably was still doing harm to you, but because of your high superhuman level of resilience with it, you just put up with it. You just pretended it wasn't happening, or like, I can handle it. No, you can't, nor should you ever have had to handle it. Hear me out. I'll say it again, nor should you ever have had to handle that. I want you to really resonate with that. This was never yours. This was never your fault. Ever, never in the history of ever. This is them. You have that narcissistic mom. This is her shit. This is not your shit. But you've learned how to manage that. And now in midlife, your body is like, I can't. I'm done. I just can't. And I want you to listen to that wisdom. Your body is telling you, this is a place where something needs to come off my plate. And what that looks like could be a million different ways. And on a very extreme side, it's I don't have any contact with that family member anymore. But many of us decide to still have contact with these very difficult, very toxic family members. So my suggestion to you is go find a therapist, somebody that really understands interpersonal trauma in childhood and those rigid patterns across the lifetime. Maybe even someone like myself that understands how that interfaces then in midlife. And I want you to unpack whatever those childhood injuries were, because if you don't, they are going to be the thing that creates the midlife crisis. I guarantee you. Every single time I've worked with somebody in a midlife crisis, it comes right back to those things, because it happens to be those toxic patterns that are causing you the most distress, period, in your life, that were being covered up by the superhuman ability to tolerate distress. Now that that superhuman ability and the hormones have gone away, now you've got yourself, I better deal with this and I better deal with it now, interfacing with, and I've done it for decades of my life in a different way that has been harming me. That's a hard thing to rewrite. You don't just create a new habit interpersonally with somebody overnight when you've had a certain habit for a long time. And part of those habits, it has nothing to do with you interacting with them. It's the way it makes you feel on the inside when they are who they are, when they're saying the things they're saying. You might even reasonably be able to say to yourself, this doesn't make any sense. My mom is making it about her that I'm going through this hard time. But it doesn't matter that you know better. You don't feel better. And you don't do better yet. The feel better and do better is hard work. And I would just encourage you, if you're bumping up against one of these things, to seriously consider doing some therapy, unpacking that, figuring out a different way, a better way, and a new habit to start to form in your midlife so that you can start to have that centered midlife. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these two crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME, home, to 741-741 to the crisis text line. And you can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.